All right, so now that we have talked about the introduction to imperialism, we're going to take a look at some of the specific places around the world that were controlled by these areas. And I want to start with Africa. So Africa is obviously one of the largest continents in the world, and for a long time Britain was or Europe, not just Britain, they were kind of afraid of Africa because, you know, they didn't understand it. It was dangerous to go into the interior of Africa. There were a lot of diseases that Britain or the Europeans weren't used to that they could catch, so they didn't really have the right medicine for it. They didn't really have the right equipment for it. However, once industrialization begins, it kind of opens up Africa to Europeans. So if you look here at these two maps, you can sort of see how Africa changes during this period. So this is something we call the scramble for Africa, which basically means once the Europeans realized they could take over Africa, they went nuts. Right? So if you look at this first map, you'll notice that European nations really only stuck to the edges, the exception being Egypt and down the Nile River here. But you'll look and see the French and the Portuguese and the British, they really kind of kept to the coast. They didn't travel in the interior. In the interior, we see a lot more indigenous powers. These are kingdoms that are strong, independent kingdoms. However, once the scramble for Africa happens, all of Africa sort of becomes part of these European colonies. There are two exceptions. There are only two countries in Africa that don't fall into that, which we'll talk about in just a second. So the scramble for Africa is really just about this idea that everybody wants to get into the interior, right? And so at first, but that should probably say the 1860s, not the 1880s. So in the 1860s, the Europeans only controlled about 10% of Africa, all on the coast. By the 1870s, they really began the exploration of the interior. Like I said, there are a few reasons this happens. The invention of quinine, which is a medicine that fights malaria, was a big help. New technologies like the gun, better weapons, better, transportation. That all allows people to kind of move into the interior a little bit. So weapons, transportation, medicines, that sort of thing. But everybody was going after Africa so quickly that basically Europe just said, you know what? We need to sit down and sketch this out, right? Because some of us are falling behind, some of us are not able to get the colonies we want to get, and basically we need to make sure this is fair. So in 1884, they set a conference up in Berlin that basically established the rules for how they were going to divide up Africa. So there are a few things that they came up with. So first, you can't claim a territory you don't already have control of. So if you are not already there and if somebody else is in control of it, you can't take it from them. You have to outlaw the slave trade. That was a big deal. Slavery is already starting to be outlawed in most places. And the idea behind this, like I said, is try to prevent conflict between European powers. It doesn't work. Spoilers, right? So this is sponsored by Bismarck and the French president at the time, Jules Ferry. And so it was really kind of in a lot of ways targeted at Britain because they were the ones who had most of the territory. So that's sort of what we are going to see here. So by 1914, almost all of Africa has been taken by European powers. The two exceptions are Liberia and what was then called Abyssinia, which we now call Ethiopia. So these two countries remained independent. Liberia was set up as an American kind of offshoot where a bunch of Africans, former slaves from America, decided they wanted to go back to Africa. So they set up this little independent country. So that's why nobody really tried to go after that. People did actually try to go to Ethiopia, but Ethiopia is the only successful country in warding off a European power, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So it's kind of an unusual thing. So let's go country by country here so we can sort of break this down. So first we have Portugal. So Portugal really didn't have a lot of influence left. If you look at this map here, they're not holding on to much. By the 18th century, they had lost most of their colonies. However, they still held on to a couple influential colonies. However, they didn't really have a lot of support at home for their overseas colonies. There wasn't a lot of, Portugal's not a super strong country, so they didn't really have a lot of people at home supporting it. The decline of the slave trade also hurt the Portuguese colonies. Portugal really kind of controlled most of the slave trade. So when Britain outlawed the slave trade and then passed a law in 1839 that said the British could board any Portuguese ships in order to prevent the slave trade, it kind of meant Portugal didn't need their colonies anymore. The only two that they held on to was Angola and Mozambique, mostly because of the rivers there. They were influential for transportation. So those are really only it. So if you also look here, you'll notice the brown is Spain. So Spain also didn't really have a lot, mostly because Britain controlled Gibraltar. So if you remember, Gibraltar is that little bitty rock basically off the coast of Spain that the British got in the War of Spanish Succession with Louis XIV. And they'd been controlling it ever since. And the problem is that it is basically the gap between Europe and Africa. So because Britain controlled it, Spain really couldn't get into Africa very much. They were also a lot more worried about their colonies in Latin America and Asia. They were starting to lose control of them. A lot of their Latin American colonies were starting to declare independence. A lot of their Asian colonies were getting lost to other nations, such as the United States. So that's really where they put most of their focus. After the Berlin Conference, they sort of pick off whatever's left, the things that nobody else wanted. So their main colonies are Spanish Morocco, Spanish West Africa, and Spanish Guinea. Next, we have France. So France, as you can see, controlled a pretty big portion of North Africa. So their goal was basically saying, we want to make up for our defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. We got our butts kicked in that war, and we want to show that we're not as weak as that war made us look. They also want to make sure that the British have limited control over Egypt. That was a British influenced area, and they wanted to make sure that the British weren't the only ones that had influence in Egypt. So their goal was to kind of get a horizontal band going across the top of Africa here. And you can see they almost did it, right? They got about halfway, and Egypt kind of got in the way for them there. So their major colonies that you're definitely going to want to know, Algeria, Tanzania, Morocco, French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, and Madagascar. So these are kind of the big colonies that France has. Next, we have Italy. So Italy, as you can imagine, is as you can think about, is a relatively new country at the time. They didn't really like the French, so they kind of resented that the French controlled so much of North Africa. And if you look very carefully, you can see Italy's actually closer to North Africa, right? So with France being all over here, it's kind of a threat to them. So they wanted to make sure that they had their own colonies. So their big ones are Libya, Eritrea, and the Italian Somaliland. Now, Italy also attempted to conquer Ethiopia. However, the Ethiopians were a pretty civilized, quote unquote, society. They were a lot more like Europeans. They were already Christians, which kind of helped that, sort of why Europe had left them alone for a while. And they were already a little industrial. And so when the Italians tried to take them over, the Ethiopians were fighting on home territory, and they defeated them at the Battle of Ndoa. And they become the first and only African nation that manages to defeat a European one, and they remained independent as a result of that. Italy is going to very much resent this, and when Mussolini takes over during World War II, he is going to attempt to take Ethiopia back. So that's kind of just one of those things to keep in the back of your mind. Next, we have Belgium. So the Belgian territory is interesting because, first of all, it's not owned by Belgium itself. It's actually owned by the King of Belgium. So rather than being a Belgian colony, it's like King Leopold's own personal colony. And it's mostly about control of the rubber and ivory trade. Those are the two big exports from there. And this is in the Congo region. So it's very much in the interior. It's known as kind of the heart of darkness, right? Leopold, the government that he set up there, basically stripped the native of any rights. And they started exporting rubber, and it became in really high demand. And they began to use the natives essentially as slaves. And the world sort of looked the other way from a lot of the atrocities of the Belgian government. And we're going to see some of those more in class. But it's estimated that over 10 million Congolese people were killed. Eventually, the Belgian government does take over, take it away from the king, but they don't really clean it up too much. And it's pretty horrific, some of the things that go on in the Belgian Congo and the effects that it has on the world, the rest of world history. Next, we have Germany. So Germany wanted a horizontal belt across Central Africa. As you can see, not quite as successful as the French. So at first, Germany was not really interested in colonization. Bismarck was much more focused on unifying Germany. However, once Germany got unified, Bismarck was like, all right, great. Now we want colonies. So that's sort of where this comes, what is called a place in the sun for Germany. The idea that we're gonna, join up with the big boys here, right? Kind of find our colonies. So the German colonies are what are modern day Namibia and Tanzania. So German East Africa and German Southwest Africa, Cameroon and Togoland are the big German ones. Last but not least, we have Great Britain. So I want you to look at this political cartoon here. We've got our British guy who's got his foot in South Africa and his foot in Egypt. So the British controlled all of it, pretty much. So in 1875, British bought shares in the Suez Canal, which is a canal on the Nile River, sold to them by the Egyptian government, and this really gives them a lot of control. So their goal was to get a vertical string of colonies across the whole country, from Cape to Cairo, so Cape of Good Hope, that's in South Africa, to Cairo, which is in Egypt. And this was said by a British minister named Cecil Rhodes. That's actually who's in this cartoon here. And so Cecil Rhodes is the foreign minister. His job is to kind of help keep these colonies secure. So some of their major colonies, these are not all of their colonies. These are just their biggies. We have Egypt, Sudan, the British East Africa, Nigeria, Rhodesia, and South Africa. And they actually take South Africa away from the Dutch. It's going to be a big sort of conflict down there. There's a war that's fought over that territory. That's Great Britain. And as you can see, they get their vertical string of colonies, right? It's pretty straightforward. Now, the effects of colonization on Africa are pretty severe. So obviously, when Europeans were dividing up the borders of their colonies, they didn't really give any thought to the ethnic groups that lived there. They didn't ask the Africans for their opinion. They didn't ask anybody for, their thoughts on the thing. So when they divided it up, a lot of times what ended up happening is rival and enemy tribal groups were put into the same colony and expected to live under the same government, which is going to cause a lot of major conflicts. Now, the governments themselves are controlled almost exclusively by Europeans. They didn't let the Africans really control any part of the government. But what that meant was when the Europeans pulled out of Africa at the end of World War II and started decolonizing, they just kind of said, all right, have fun. And they left no system of government, no bureaucracy, nothing for the African people. And that really allowed a lot of corruption to come in. So there's no institutional structure set up for the natives. And this is going to lead to a lot of issues in the modern world. Genocide, dictatorship, corruption, famine, poverty, you name it. It has experienced in Africa. And it's really because of the fact that they just didn't really give any thought to these colonies. Of course, there's also a lot of prejudice, like a lot of prejudice that we're going to see evident in these colonies, which are eventually going to become the modern day Africa. So this kind of wraps up Africa for us. Next, we're going to be taking a look at Asia and the Pacific. So we'll move on when we get there.